The program is preparing more than 100 outstanding undergraduates to report for South African news media from Johannesburg and Cape Town newsrooms. Outside the MTC Forum, you can see an exhibit and view a video loop on the center TV screen that celebrate the work of the program students. I would like the students who will be reporting from South Africa next quarter to please stand so that we may recognize them. All right, so here we go. Now that I've embarrassed them, we'll go on.
They'll get back at you for that.
Doug and I owe a great debt to the dozens of people from this campus who have helped make the program a success. For example, Deborah Greenspan and Carrie Fuse at the university, and Michelle Batoon and Desi Hanford at Medill. The exhibit out front, the exhibits were created by Medill graduate students Alice Galucci and Brooke Worknell, and staffers Jessica Gilbert and Ryan Dietz, and I appreciate their help. But I also would like to take a moment this Valentine's Day to send a special Valentine to the dozens of South African journalists who have invited our students into their homes as well as their newsrooms, and who have taken the 17-hour flight from South Africa to spend weeks here preparing our students for their reporting quarter in Johannesburg and Cape Town. I salute older generations of South African journalists of color, people like Peter Magubane, Moxon Williams, and Joe Chloe, who worked for the anti-apartheid alternative press or struggled to stay sane and alive at white-owned newspapers that focus on sex and soccer. For instance, Chloe, a Union of Black Journalists leader, was imprisoned for a total of more than 3.5 years in the 70s and 80s, and often placed in solitary, even tortured. They would throw a blanket over me, Chloe told me, and keep my hands and feet handcuffed, and I'd be seated on the floor, and they would pour cold water down my back, and then they would put electrodes on my back, and then I would scream and scream. The guards, working in 3 8-hour shifts, tortured nonstop. The 42-year-old Mondli Makhanya, one of South Africa's most prominent journalists, symbolizes a new generation of news leadership. He grew up addicted to the news. He delivered newspapers as a boy, and when he went away to school, he insisted that his mother save all the local newspapers so he could read the stack of papers when he returned home. At age 19, faced with a decision between attending Rhodes University with its outstanding journalism school or becoming a cub reporter, he chose reporting at the Weekly Mail, a feisty alternative paper that, despite the constant threat of censorship and closure from the government, forced official admission of wrongdoing with its courageous reports of corrupt political payments and military involvement in political violence, to quote Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. Makhanya, Sunday Times political columnist and until recently group editor-in-chief of the Sunday Times parent company, he's on leave to write a book, also chairs the South African National Editors Forum. As an editor, he has inspired some of South Africa's most courageous and hard-hitting investigative journalism. He served as editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian when it revealed the involvement of Jacob Zuma, currently South Africa's president, in massive corruption. He was editor-in-chief of the Sunday Times when it broke the story about rape charges against Zuma. He has spearheaded opposition to the government's attempts to curb media freedoms through statutory regulation and secrecy legislation. Makhanya will be questioned this afternoon by Medill professor Doug Foster, author of After Mandela, The Struggle for Freedom in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Please join Doug and me in welcoming Mondli Makhanya.
Cool. Well, part of this process for Lauren and me is to make sure that what we get out of coming to South Africa and putting our students in South African newsrooms has a feedback loop to our community, both students and our colleagues here at Medill. So we try every year to do some kind of event that cracks open that experience. So it's great to have you here, Mondli. I wanted to start with a personal question, if you don't mind, which is to kind of place your own life and career trajectory in a kind of context for us. So you're born in 1970, halfway through that period of an extreme, peculiar form of legalized racial oppression known as apartheid. And I want to just start with what it looked like for you as a boy of 11 in 1981, headed into some of the most violent period of the resistance to apartheid, in light of the fact that you've got a son about that age, two sons, 11 and 12, as a way of just getting us started in thinking about what's changed, what hasn't changed, a kind of personal reflection of what somebody growing up in KwaZulu-Natal, a black boy, could expect in terms of prospects in their lives in 1981 and what it looks like now.
Thanks, and it's really great to be here, and I would appreciate it though if somebody had told me about the temperature outside before I got on the plane from Johannesburg.
If we had warned you, you wouldn't have come. That was part of the game.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, growing up during that period, obviously, as you know, apartheid was at its zenith at that particular point. Not only in terms of the implementation of apartheid, but also in terms of repression. The apartheid government was using a jackboot to crush all opposition. The media was silenced, and journalists were going to jail. Journalists were being, newspapers were being shut down, and journalists were going into exile. And as I was mentioning to somebody earlier on, what newspapers often resorted to in order to tell people just how much they could not tell them, they would cancel out, rub out certain sentences and certain pictures in order to just tell people this is how much we cannot tell you. But being a young person in the 1980s, with obviously one hopes for a future ahead of them, and I decided that yes, I do. The career that I want to pursue is a career in journalism. I kind of made up my mind quite early on. One knew at that point that as a black person there is a ceiling. I think it was a life of ceilings, where whatever profession you were in, you could only go so far. And yes, you could educate yourself. Your parents would do their utmost to put you through school and use their meager resources to put you through school and beyond. And then you may get into, you may or may not be able to get into a profession, but you knew that at some point you could only go so far. Now, I project forward to the year 2013, where we are now. And there's often a narrative that particularly with us inside the country, we look at things that go wrong in South Africa, we look at the wrongness of, we look at how the government is not doing this, is not doing that, and the failures here and there. Which, yes, we should be doing, and we should be holding the government to account, we should be holding kind of the fire under their feet. Which is our role, not only as journalists, but as the rest of society. But what we often fail to do is to fully recognize the true extent and the miracle of 1994, what it has actually done, the fact that society has transformed. I look at myself as an example. One shouldn't, we journalists, we tell stories about other people, so it's wrong to talk about yourself. But just as myself as an example, let's say there was a ceiling back then, but as a young black South African, I have progressed to a level where before 1994, the conditions would never have allowed me to. There are other editors and other people in senior positions in the country who have done wonderfully, because what 1994 meant was that the opportunity, the country did become a country of opportunities, and the country did actually open up and manage to give us the opportunities to move ahead. That having been said, there are people who got left behind, and a lot of people haven't got left behind, even in the democratic society. I always quote an example of a young woman, of a classmate of mine, who was the cleverest girl in class. I went to school with her up until 4th grade, and then I was able to move to a different school, to a boarding school after that. But I went to a school with her in a rural area where my grandparents lived. She was by far, she was super, super, super brilliant. And the second best placed person in class was like miles behind her. And she could only get up to grade 6 in school because her parents were too poor to do anything about it. And I met her about 6-7 years ago when I was editor of the Sunday Times. And she was looking old and haggard and still living in the rural area. She was married with several kids. And so she recognized me, and she told me who she was, and I didn't recognize her. And basically what had happened to her, she had got married, as I said, she had kids, and her life had stopped. And I thought, if she had had just half the opportunities that I had, and half the opportunities that maybe a white South African had, this person would be a nuclear scientist, that she would be working at NASA, she would be, she could be anything in the world. And I just think of those people, as we celebrate, the next year we're celebrating 20 years of democracy in South Africa, that there are so many others that have been left behind by the train. And I think that's the challenge for us as South Africans going forward that we should meet.
Let's talk a little bit about your career. It was a meteoric rise. At the age of 33, you take over one of the most influential, largest circulation papers in the country. If we think in our terms about somebody becoming editor of the New York Times or the Washington Post or the LA Times, that's the equivalent, 33 years old. Did it feel meteoric on the inside, or did it feel like things were moving very slowly?
Look, the newspaper that you speak about, Mondli Makhanya Times, it's a massive ship in terms of influence in South Africa. It sets the agenda for the week. The conversation in South Africa begins with the Sunday Times on Sunday. So the big challenge, obviously, is to make sure that that conversation is the right conversation, and it's a conversation that's actually meaningful to South Africans. So I would say at that particular point, the key thing for me as editor was to make sure that those people in power recognize, not only the people in political power and also in corporate power, recognize that the Sunday Times, as the epitome of South African media, punches at the correct weight, that it actually represents the democracy that we are in, that it protects the democracy that we're in, and that it speaks on behalf of those, yes, those who are voiceless, but also those who actually do have a voice, but a very soft voice, and that it makes that voice boom. I think at that particular point, I did not consider the age that I was at. It was the task at hand that actually mattered.
So you had been, growing up, a supporter of the ANC, of the African National Congress. You were suddenly in a position, as you come into first the Weekly Mail and then the Mail and Guardian, of writing stories quite critical of the party that in many respects was responsible for liberating you, liberating the country. Say some things about what that was like, because I think all of us face, as journalists, a question about the way in which our backgrounds and our political beliefs shape, hopefully contribute to our understanding of what the coverage is that we should be doing. But but may at times struggle with this sense of an internal dialogue about where the primary responsibility lies. I wonder what it was like for you as a trainee, particularly given that so many people saw media in general as white-controlled, white-dominated. So many still do, even though these outlets are now largely run editorially by black people. I wonder what that was like for you.
Just a slight correction when you say the party that liberated us. I think like what we try to, I think the way many South Africans see the ANC is that as a party that led their liberation.
Okay.
Yeah, because I think we like to see ourselves as people who liberated ourselves. I think we took the risks and we faced the bullets of the regime at the time. The ANC was in leadership, but I think that's the difference between South Africa and a lot of other countries on the continent, and particularly in Southern Africa, like Zimbabwe, which were liberated by guerrilla forces. I think the South African people actually took the liberation into their own hands, and so they feel a greater ownership of their freedom than many other people. But that having been said, we do recognize the leadership of the ANC having liberated us.
And I'm sure that the first time you wrote something that was critical of the ANC, there was somebody who called and said, "We are your liberator. What are you doing?"
But of course, we worshipped the leadership of the ANC when we were growing up. We sang songs about the leaders in exile, the Nelson Mandelas who were in jail, the Oliver Tambos who were in exile, and we venerated them, as I say, and they were our leaders. So come 1994, it is now, the democracy has set in, and there was an expectation from the ANC, from the government, that somehow, because they were our liberators, that they would be welcomed as such, and they would be respected as such, that they would be treated as these semi-gods. But with the media, I think we decided quite early on, we didn't go into any conclave and kind of and reach certain decisions. But I think instinctively—
It wasn't a secret meeting.
There was not. But what we did do very instinctively as South African journalists, and particularly black journalists, and particularly those black journalists who had been involved in the struggle, was that they were now in power. And what we would do was to make sure that that the dreams and ideals for which the struggle had been fought would be maintained and met by those who were now in government, that they would not be treated as demigods or semi-gods, whatever, that what we would do is that we would hold them to account. In those early days, the first president of the country was Nelson Mandela, and obviously it was to be expected that, we would treat him as such. He's this global icon, he is the nearest thing to sainthood. But we didn't do that as the South African media. We actually went for him, and we treated him as a leader who would be questioned like any other leader. And the ANC got very uncomfortable because they felt that, no, but what's wrong with this picture? We're the good guys. We've always been the good guys, and we should continue to be treated as the good guys. And they started attacking the media. And
I've talked to several people who were called in by Mandela himself very early on, and sat down and asked, what is it? What is it that's going on? You're writing stories critical of me, critical of the government. Where is your loyalty?
Yeah, that is true. And in fact, he himself could not quite fully understand this thing. But to his credit, he got it. When the editors and journalists would actually kind of stand their ground and actually explain to him, Mr. President, there is a constitution, and the constitution expressly protects media freedom. This is the role of the media, 1, 2, 3. He became our biggest champion, the biggest champion of media freedom inside the ANC, inside the cabinet. And he would then be the one who was now telling people in the ANC about these people are doing their jobs. And it was a very important thing for him to set that tone in those first 5 years, because I think if he had not set that tone and allowed the wolves to come at us at that particular point, we may be living in a different kind of South Africa today, and the state of media freedom in South Africa may not be what it is at this particular point in time. And we have seen in more recent times the hostility towards media freedom coming through in South Africa. But I think our space and our place in a free and open democratic society was set in stone during those 5 years of democracy.
Okay, so let's roll forward and talk a little bit about Jacob Zuma and the relationship of just re-elected president of the ANC in the middle of his first term as president of the country. You've, from the beginning in your career, you've been involved in some of the biggest stories of corruption, malfeasance in office, from there to stories about his quite active romantic life, breaking the story that he was accused of rape. In a trial, he was later acquitted of that charge. But I wonder what it was like to oversee as editor and to write some of the stories about those events, about somebody who I imagine you grew up having a great deal of respect for as chief of intelligence of the ANC, as a guerrilla fighter, as somebody with an oversized reputation for having been involved in taking big risks to fight.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, in the 1980s, during the struggle, and Jacob Zuma, as you say, was outside. He was head of intelligence of the ANC underground, and he was one of those mystical figures that, you know, people would speak about in hushed tones. That there's this guy called Jacob Zuma in exile, and like, you know, and when they came back from exile, and he was one of the first people who who came back to the country to do the preliminary negotiations with the apartheid government, and he was this big guy, and through those early days, even after the unbannings of the organizations and through the first few years, he was somebody that that we all had a connection with. South Africans had a connection with. He's a gregarious guy. He's a warm person. He's a person that people find it very easy to make a connection with. And in fact, before we started to write those stories, he and I actually had a very good relationship. At that point, I'd been a political correspondent and a political editor just before I became a full editor. And during that period when then President Thabo Mbeki was going off tangent on HIV/AIDS, and the country was very depressed and very conflictual around the subject, it was not a good climate in the country.
So just a parenthesis for people who may not know, the second president of the country, Thabo Mbeki, Mandela's successor, did not believe in the link between HIV and AIDS, and there was a period in which treatment was not available in public health clinics. So there was this very contentious within the party, and obviously on the streets,
in the greater society,
in the rebellion, particularly of people like the Treatment Action Campaign, trying to hold him to account for that view.
Yeah. Jacob Zuma was the person, during that period, Jacob Zuma was the person that, a lot of people actually, he was the good guy. You all looked to him as he was a person that we could relate to. And many of us thought, we would have, whenever we interacted with him, we would say, why isn't this guy the president? And things changed. In 2003, at that point, I was editor of the Mail and Guardian. We broke the first story about his involvement in corruption, quite massive corruption, and his involvement with French arms dealers and and money that he had taken from other business people. And it was a litany of things that he'd been involved in. And I remember when the reporters, when the investigative team came to talk to me, they called me out onto the balcony, and they said, no, there's always a fear, I think, in any newsroom in the world that some intelligence agent might be bugging you. They called me out onto the balcony.
Well, I'm just going to stop you right there, because it may not be everybody's experience that they're in a newsroom talking about a major story and thinking they have to go on the balcony because the newsroom may be bugged. So just,
Just
Just a parenthesis.
okay, parenthesis noted. We got onto the balcony, and they asked me, kind of like, "So, are you sure you're ready for us for this?" And they tell me this thing that Jacob Zuma is involved in corruption, and we've got the documents there, and we sit and we peruse the documents. Can't tell you how my heart sank at that particular point, because this was. I mean, like at this point, Jacob Zuma was deputy president of the country. He was deputy president of the African National Congress, and he was the guy who's generally seen as as the next president of the country. So it said what it said was that that's how high corruption goes. And anyway, we ran with the story that Friday and it set the ball rolling, and more revelations came out, and my whole view of Jacob Zuma changed at that particular point, and I started writing kind of like opinion pieces, analysis about him, and he started to, and lots of people, and like I had emissaries from him, and kind of like people close to him trying to tell me that, we should stop, because, some saying that we're being used by Mbeki, some saying we're being used by intelligence agencies, and there was some kind of like attempts at strong arming us as well to stop that reporting. But by this point, I mean, like the fire was growing. Other newspapers were also reporting on the story, which actually is a great thing in journalism. That kind of like, let's share the pain. So that was quite a. But I mean, like that period set the tone for how Jacob Zuma then became to be perceived in public. Then, for my sins in 2005, late 2005, he's no longer deputy president of the country. He's been fired because one of the people who had corrupted him, which was his financial advisor, he had been convicted of corruption. So obviously he could not stay in office as well as deputy president of the country. So he had been fired by the president at the time, and he was out in the wilderness, and the campaign to get him into power was the campaign to unseat Mbeki and get Zuma as president was gaining momentum. Then he was charged with corruption. Then he was accused of rape. And this young woman who he had allegedly raped at the time had later charged at the police station. The police were frightened off by this big figure, and they took the charge sheet and they took it to the provincial headquarters. The provincial headquarters hid this thing while a political decision was taken about whether to proceed with this thing or not. We got information of this, and we had to prove that a charge exists and what led to the charge. And we did our investigative work, and people, we cross-check, but the thing is, we did not have a piece of paper in our hands saying that there is a charge against Jacob Zuma, and we had to basically go on the trust of what we have. And I remember that editorial conference that day. It was a Saturday afternoon, and we sat around the table. We had our lawyers in, and we debated, and our lawyers said, like, with the information you have, you would be safe from a lawsuit because you have gone through all the steps that you needed to have taken. You just basically now have to decide whether you go with the story or not. And it was that sort of thing that, you go with the story, and it explodes in your face the following day, the following week. Or you don't go with the story, and he would have gotten away with it. Basically, had we not gone with the story, he would never have been charged. The trial would never have happened. The whole thing would have been covered up. So we had to make a decision, and like after a lot of lively debate, the whole table shuts up.
They're waiting for you to make the call.
And there's like silence for like a whole half a minute to 45 seconds, and everybody's staring at one guy to make this decision. And I think it was probably, I'd say, probably the heaviest decision I've ever had to make, heavier than the decision to get married. But it was that moment, kind of like you kind of know that you go this way. It could have been the damage to myself, but more importantly, the damage to the newspaper and the people who worked with the newspaper would have been so great. It could have sunk the newspaper in a big way. But the alternative would have been that an injustice would have been committed, that the cause of justice would not have been done. There would have been a cover-up. Yes, he stood trial, and in the course of the trial, we found out a lot more things about him that we did not know, and which kind of like spoke to his suitability or unsuitability of office. Yes, he was acquitted at the end, but I think we got to a measure of that person, Jacob Zuma. So, just I've taken quite a detour in answering your question, but I think that during the in covering those stories, in my newspapers covering those stories, and in our coverage of the current president of the republic, I think we have been able to give the nation and the world a sense of who he is, and he believes in his paranoid ways that there must be a vendetta, because like all these things have happened at different newspapers when I've been there. But actually, it was about service to the public and service to the country, about them knowing who this particular person is, and then they can make their choice. And the country made their choice, and they said, okay, fine, we want this guy.
Well,
we've seen the product on the shelf.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because I've never seen, in all my years anywhere in the country reporting, somebody who was in the wilderness like that come back. So at the point when I met him was the day he was acquitted on the rape charge. He had been fired as deputy president. He was charged with corruption. I would say, among newspapers, there was nobody really advocating his cause, and yet he was able to succeed in a fight back campaign that first allowed him to take control of the party and then of the country. So you sound okay with the idea that the media did its role, and then it's up to the political process to shake out, given what's known, people to choose to support him and for him to come back. But say a little bit more about that. And the other thing, I'll just do two at once, and it gives you more time to answer these together. Here is somebody who is the most highly placed Zulu-speaking official in the ANC, official in the country when he was deputy president. And you come from KwaZulu-Natal, so I'm wondering whether that played any role in either you feeling like you had to hold him to a different kind of account, and what kind of pressure there was on you as a result of that.
Yeah. Look, he's a master political player. I think there are very few politicians in the world who are able to play the political game that Zuma
I agree
does.
with you.
Yeah. Because as you say, he was down and out, and he's got all these accusations against him, and
everybody told me at the time, 2005, 2006, don't bother spending any time with Zuma as I began the work for the book. Don't bother. He's past his sell-by date. Mbeki's in the process of crushing him. Don't spend any time getting to know him. Almost everybody.
Yeah. What he was aided by at that particular point, and there's a point I need to come back to just now. In fact, let me start with that point. Yeah. Just to take a track back, and then I'm sure it's something we may revisit later on in this conversation. The president, the person who's currently president of the Republic, if all things being equal, given what we all know, given everything that he's gone through, not only kind of like his corruptibility, but also just his ability to govern. He's a terrible administrator. He doesn't keep time. He can't. You've got his speech. His State of the Nation address in front of you. He barely manages to get a proper speech together. So it's like he is not. The person who rises to the top should somehow approximate the best you have in your country, almost. I know you asked me about George Bush, but that's another story altogether. But like, you aim to have the best among you, rise to that. But like, there are so many things that should have counted against him, and so it would be a no-brainer somehow that Jacob Zuma should not go anywhere near office. And in my head, over the past couple of days since I've been here, and I'm like, I have lots of debates with Zuma supporters, very passionate Zuma supporters in the country, and they find all sorts of excuses why, he's the right guy, and I've never understood. In the past few days that I've been here, and I've been following the gun control debate, and for me as a South African, as in somebody from outside, that's another no-brainer. I'm thinking like, how could people be so passionate about something so that doesn't debate, that doesn't deserve this kind of like, this passion of debate? I'm like, especially after the incidents that kind of like, that have happened over the past couple of months, and it's, so, yeah, the political behavior, social behavior, the rational thinking of human beings is something that kind of like, that's quite difficult to fathom. But like, that was like just an off-ramp on my part. But Jacob Zuma was aided in 2005 by, between 2005 and 2007. And in 2007, the ANC had this big conference in one of the northern cities called Polokwane, where Jacob Zuma ousted Thabo Mbeki as president of the ANC, and then which opened the way for him to become president in 2009. Mbeki was an unpopular person. He's very aloof, he's very scholarly, he's very professorial, and with all due respect to professors, I'm like
Yeah, what was wrong with that
some
part?
of my
The
best friends,
professorial,
I know some very good people who are professors.
he suddenly remembered where he was.
And he had no connection with the public. He was quite a ruthless leader in terms of his political behavior. I'm like, he wasn't ruthless, and he didn't lock people up in jail, he didn't beat people up. But he was ruthless in his kind of like in his manipulation of political processes, and which made him very unpopular within the party. He was not a great listener. He was very authoritarian. He knew and decided where things should go within the party, within the country. Just like with the AIDS thing, I mean, like, he had read up so much about AIDS that he knew more than all the scientists and doctors and experts in the country about HIV/AIDS, and they were not going to tell him anything. I mean, like, he was the greatest scientist the country had ever known.
But he was also relying on a University of California at Berkeley
Yeah, well, I mean, like, he had
expert, and he liked the idea that these were counterintuitive rebels within their professions, and he latched onto them as his experts, even though they were far afield from antiretroviral, knowing anything about antiretrovirals.
Yeah, I mean, like, he had an almost romantic attraction to the denialists, and and so all those things. I mean, like, his behavior around AIDS. I mean, like, his behavior within the party, and his treatment of potential successors whom he did not want to have. He did not want to have succeed him, because he favored other people whom he could possibly control from the grave. All of that basically made him unpopular in the party. And Zuma, being the popular guy that he was, like being the gregarious and warm and chattable character that he was at least able to, he became the rallying point. He was able to appeal to people saying, this is what we want. I mean, like, at least, here's somebody who can give me hours and we can sit and we can chat. He would go to funerals of old comrades in deep rural areas, people who had been forgotten by the powers that be, and like, he would just turn up in some village, and people felt, and like, that spreads, and people kind of think, do you know that Jacob Zuma was here? And and word gets around that,
No, I saw him doing that in 2006, 2007. What always struck me was how he could seem to engage with people, seem to be agreeing with everybody, while not saying anything to them. So his two favorite verbal responses are to say, absolutely. If you've finally figured out what to say that he agrees with, or is that so? Is that so? So people went away from those encounters. I saw him going all over the country and talking to very divergent constituencies, and not saying I'm with you, but an astonishingly good listener. And he would say, is that so? Absolutely. And everybody would go away thinking, I have my tribune, I have my advocate.
Yeah, you missed out on two other words. It's absolutely my brother or absolutely my sister.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's shift gears slightly. Since you're in Chicago, you've come to the U.S., you arrived in time for the State of the Nation speech. This is an opportunity to turn the lens around a little bit. You started talking about, not understanding the strong attraction of Americans to gun rights. But what else has struck you watching the State of the Nation address or being in Chicago at the moment?
Besides the weather?
The last couple of days have been like summertime, man.
Yeah. I would really say kind of like the gun issue is the primary thing that really has struck me about this country. I mean, from afar, that there's this big gun debate that happens here. I think, you read newspapers. We read American newspapers, and you'll watch CNN, and these crazies coming up. But just the intensity of it is for me the thing that actually that really has stood out over the past few days. There was a story I read the other day I think it was in the Tribune it was in the Tribune about a gun enthusiast, and this journalist goes into his house and she's interviewing him, and he's there with a fellow gun enthusiast, and his 9-year-old daughter is in the room, and he invites her over to join in the interview, and prompts her, gets the journalist to ask this girl questions, and she gets to answer questions about why we need guns, and if somebody comes into this house, we must shoot him and must kill him, and this is a guy fathering this 9-year-old, and so I think that obsession with guns is kind of really is a thing that in this particular point, obviously it's the most topical issue at this point. So it's I think I came at either the right or the wrong time. I don't know, but so that's the one thing that really. But again, and then I think turning to the State of the Union. If you go to South Africa and there's this year's group will find out when they get there about how envious people are of the ability of the man who occupies that number 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, to the oratory of that man versus the pedantic, plodding way in which our president. What did strike me about it was, it was the ability in that speech to mix vision with basically kind of an oratory and practical things about what needs to be done and what will be done. But at the same time, what was also very, very, very stark was the meanness of this moment in American politics and in American society. Listening to it, it seemed to me quite a unifying speech, which was appealing to kind of a very broad range of things, which kind of everybody could latch onto. You can differ about how to get there, but broadly, kind of this is what needs to be done, and let's do it in an inclusive fashion. And then watching the man lurch for his water immediately thereafter, and then give a speech that was totally rejectionist. And then the analysis by some kind of more Republican people on the various networks. I mean, I happened to hop after the speech through the networks, and the tone was a rejectionist one, that no, we cannot do business with this administration. Yes, there will be elections next year, and I think people need to position themselves for that kind of like, you're not expecting them to praise Obama and say, look, I'm like, a fantastic speech, but like, I think there's no nuance in American politics at this point in time, and I say, I've just parachuted in here. I don't know anything.
Well,
but like,
what American reporters do in South Africa all the time. So,
so yeah, so I would say the one thing that really kind of like over the past few days that has really hit me is the meanness of spirit at this particular point in time, and kind of like I don't know where that takes the nation in going forward. There will be an election next year. Things will get meaner, and once you get to that point, after that election, there's going to be another election in 2 years. 2 years after that. Will that be the permanent feature of American politics and American society? I know kind of like, yeah, the rivalry between the two parties has always been there. It's always been intense, but there just seems to be something very toxic and poisonous in the air at the moment.
I mean, it's great to get the view of somebody who's coming in, because I would say that 2000, 2004 were a whole lot more toxic and poisonous, and that the overall atmosphere is actually better. So for you to come in and say it seems so poisonous and poisoned and so toxic maybe tells us something about how much further there is to go. I want to stay just on violence for a minute, and then we're going to open it up. So I imagine that it was a little bit of a shock for you to wake up to the way in which Oscar Pistorius' shooting of his girlfriend was reported in the US, but I don't know for sure. So yesterday, the Paralympian double amputee, remarkable runner, shot and killed his girlfriend, and that was reported in a particular way here. I wondered if you had a reaction to it.
Yeah. Well, look, it was a shock for me. I mean, like, I got up quite early this morning, and 4 o'clock, first thing I kind of like I switch on to CNN News, what's that program called, like Early Break or something like that, Early Wake Up or something. And the top item is this breaking news about Oscar Pistorius having shot. I mean, like, basically, a murder having happened. I mean, like, and they didn't know kind of like a shooting that happened, and obviously, I mean, like, they had to be careful at that time, and it's him. And whether he had like shot it deliberately or whether it was a mistake, whatever. But the fact is, Oscar Pistorius had shot someone, and him being the kind of figure he is, obviously internationally, I mean, like, he's what he is because of what he has gone through, and he's iconic. I mean, I don't think, I mean, like, he's just one of those life stories that you can't make up, you know. And within South Africa, and he's a huge unifying figure in South Africa. Everybody identifies with Oscar, and he's called by name. I mean, like, people can, like, he's not Pistorius, he's Oscar, and how everybody during the Olympics sat around their TVs and to watch him, and then obviously, I mean, like, the tragedy of that moment hit me at that particular point. And as the story unfolded, you know, the CNN crossed to their correspondent in Johannesburg, and she started talking about, and like, they're asking the reasons, like what the speculation was, and then she says, as you know, saying to the anchor who's out here, as you know, South Africa there's lots of violent crime in South Africa, and people live behind barricades and high walls, and people are armed, and she started painting this picture of South Africa that's this kind of like this violent jungle. I mean, like in the stories was about Oscar Pistorius, and like about a tragedy. And for me, I'm like not being defensive of my country. I'm like, and I think
It's okay. You're allowed a little defensiveness.
No, it's not the South Africa. The South Africa that she painted was not the South Africa that I know. I mean, like, and the South Africa has had serious crime problems, and it still has kind of a very high crime problem. But that's no longer what defines South Africa. I just think it has become the very lazy shorthand for people to define South Africa. There's a lot more to it now, as you know. You are there all the time, and then I saw subsequent reports, and they were all talking about basically the crime rate in South Africa. I mean, like everybody kept referring to the crime rate in South Africa, and bottom line is there was a romantic fallout by the looks of things in that house, and I just thought that, you know, in trying to contextualize the story, a great leap was made, which kind of like, I think was kind of a tad unfair on a country. I think we all do it about countries that we don't know about. I think probably we in South Africa would probably do the same thing about Uzbekistan. And we would probably do the same thing. I mean, like the Americans, they always go into schools and shoot up people. But yeah, so I mean, like it was just my gut feeling this morning about kind of like that. Just like
so, in a similar way, turning the telescope around a little bit. I mean, South Africa still is a violent society with a very high homicide rate. You're coming to a city with a very high homicide rate, 506 murders last year, half of them children. Is there something that you all have learned about how to cover violence and how not to cover violence that might be useful for us to think about in terms of covering crime and violence in a way that doesn't fan it and responsibly focuses on interventions that matter?
Yeah. You know, we went through a period shortly after democracy, after the birth of democracy in South Africa. That period between 1995 and 1996, and 1999, where there was a huge spike in violent crime, just immediately after conflict, obviously. And those things happen after conflicts. And all these people who had been involved in war, the country was awash with guns that you know, on the other side of the conflict, and people suddenly who had been fighting, waking up every morning fighting, that now they don't know what to do with themselves. And crime became the avenue, the outlet. And I think it set the basis for kind of like for the crime rate that still continues to plague our country now. And at that time, all of us, you know, were very alarmist, rightfully so. I mean, I think we, as I say, like we needed to put fire under the feet and the behinds of the politicians to say, like, people are dying, people are being murdered, and the government began to wake up, and they started to see this thing as like people are. The government started to see it as some like an attempt to undermine their government now, kind of like because they were starting to deliver houses and starting to deliver water, and they were achieving some successes that the media was trying to portray them in a bad light, and crime was the way to portray them in a bad light. But I think what we did not do at that point was to try, obviously, to humanize crime, to humanize the victims of crime, and to also just to get involved in how is it that we as the media, without necessarily being part of the story, but being part of the solution around crime. We were quite, not happy, but like we were quite okay with this, with those screaming headlines, which terrified people, and people actually kind of like were very terrified. I mean, like people wouldn't go to ATMs to go and draw money because they feared that someone might be behind them. People were scared to drive at night with their, you know, and even during the day, people didn't drive with their windows down. And I think what we did for the long term, in terms of we branded the country as the crime capital of the world. I mean, particularly Joburg, and is the crime capital of the world. And it's a tag that's very difficult to remove. We've matured now. I think we cover crime in much more mature ways. I mean, again, as I say, I mean, like when I said my discomfort with this morning was not because there's no crime in Joburg, there's no violent crime in Joburg. I mean, like, yeah, I mean, like, it's not. I'd be the last person to say that. I mean, like, yeah, it's not paradise, but I mean.
But maybe there's something in that sort of resistance to fanning and feeding off of it, A, and B, to allow it to be primarily become a political story as opposed to a story about social dysfunction and the response to it. Maybe there's something in there that we can learn from you guys.
Yeah, and I think kind of like the thing was like, which I would say has, I mean, like in the stories that I've read in the past week about victims of particularly gang violence here, I mean, like people are humanizing it, and I think that's the thing. I mean, like, and the fact that you know that here was this person, and I think that is what kind of like revolts people. Again, one of the things that kind of like really stood out for me was I left Johannesburg on Saturday, flying out here on Saturday night. During the course of the day, during the course of the week, there'd been the story about this woman, this teenage girl, who had been gang raped and mutilated and killed in one of the smaller towns. And there's been so much outrage in the country, and the media stopped being neutral about it. The media became part of the story. What we were getting during the course of the week is that on radio stations, there would be like irritating sounds that all radio stations, all programs, every 4 minutes, just to say kind of like every 4 minutes, there's assault on a woman, there's rape on a woman somewhere in the country. So every 4 minutes, there'd be like a chime that would go, whether your favorite song is playing, whether there's like an important person being interviewed on radio, or whether there's a football match being played, there'd be this chime or this whistle that would go. And like it was so irritating, you want to strangle the end kind of presenter, but it actually kind of like that anger, and they keep reminding you, you know, the anger that you feel at your song being interrupted is the anger that you feel at this scourge. And I think what has happened in South Africa over time is that, you can say the media has become part of the story, but there's been a lot of activism in the media against violent crime, particularly crime against women and children, that we have become part of the story. And it was an important, but last week was so key, because that move against, because I think that moment kind of like redefined, is going to redefine how media reports rape. And then I arrive here on Sunday, and there's a huge, almost similar thing around the reporting around the young woman, the teenager in Hadia. So the parallels were so stark for me around those two.
Okay, so we've bridged that gap a bit. I've got many more questions, but I've got my chance. I imagine there are questions here, things you want to raise, challenges, questions, insults, jokes. Back there.
Hi, thank you for being here. I was wondering if you could talk about the state of race relations in South Africa today compared to what it was like before apartheid ended.
Do I take one? Okay.
No, we'll do South African style. We'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll let them respond. Over here. Take the mic, Nicole, so everybody can hear you.
Sorry.
Yeah, and stand.
All right. So I follow some of my former colleagues on Facebook at the Africa Desk and E-News channel. And the rhetoric right now is about the economy shrinking, or just South Africa being the only sub-Saharan country that will not grow as much as the rest of the continent. So how do you think that is affecting the way media in South Africa is going to advance and sort of portray South Africa as this once leading country? Because if the journalists themselves are losing faith, then how is the rest of the country supposed to pick up? And is that even Zuma's fault as a bad administrator?
Okay, you got 2 or 3 in there. We'll take one more. Thanks, Nicole and Ava. Let's take one more and then give you a shot.
Yeah, hi. When I was in South Africa, one thing that I thought was particularly problematic and worrisome was Sekwale and Ramaphosa putting in serious bids to become media barons out of VUSA and I believe Independent, respectively. What do you think would be the implications if those guys get their hands, particularly with Ramaphosa as a potential favorite for the ANC presidential nomination? What would be the implications if those guys become pretty serious media tycoons?
Okay, so you've got race relations, the economy, and the future of control of the media.
Okay.
Good questions.
Yeah. On race relations, the first 5 years of democracy, we had this notion of a rainbow nation. Bishop Tutu stood up and he told us we're the rainbow people of God, and we're all like on cloud 9, believing that we've crossed the River Jordan. And the Mandela years were very much about nation building. He emphasized this thing, kind of like nation building, and which was understandable. A nation had to be forged, and at the same time, you had to appease a white population which was afraid, which kind of like was uncertain, and in certain instances afraid of its future, for its future. You had a white population that had all the skills, that was very much in control of the economy. You had a white population, which particularly the Afrikaner side of the population, which is in charge of the military and still very much in charge of the civil service. So the nation had to settle. And so those noises, kind of like his emphasis on nation building was necessary during that particular point. But what it did was it created a false sense that things were okay. And unfortunately also what he did do was that he did go overboard in the appeasement. And the effect of that was to give white South Africans the sense that nothing was ever wrong, that everything is fixed. They did not have the sense that, look, this place was wrong just a couple of years ago. You were the beneficiaries of an evil system. You accumulated this wealth and you enjoyed the wealth and you enjoyed the privileges and all of that on the back of other people's suffering. And white South Africans therefore did not take responsibility, and there was not a recognition of the wrong of the past. So those 5 years, in as much as the nation settled and we became a South Africa, it did not create a united South Africa. And there was such denialism even during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which started in 1996, when the atrocities of the past were being spoken about and they're being televised every day in the newspapers. White South Africa switched off. They did not want to know. And what you find now is that because we didn't actually kind of like, there wasn't that bitter medicine kind of like to be swallowed at that time, there was a lot of relaxation about the things that needed to have changed. So white South Africans have continued living the comfortable lives that they've always lived. And actually they've done very well out of the new South Africa, because without sanctions, without disinvestment, without isolation, they live good lives in the suburbs. And it's safe. They're not pariahs. They can travel all over the world, and they're no longer the pariahs that they once were. And so you then started to get a bit of a backlash from black South Africans about the slow pace of change, particularly economically. Kind of like, why is the economy still in the same hands? Because in as much as you have affirmative action, and white South Africans complain very much about affirmative action in South Africa. They complain about black economic empowerment, whereas actually what you find in this every year the statistics come out, and they show that, in fact, instead of changing, things actually either remain the same, or actually that white wealth is actually still growing, and that white people are still getting the jobs. A white youngster coming out of university is more likely to get to land a good job in a corporate than a black youngster coming out of university. Still, 20 years down the line, but white South Africans will still complain about affirmative action, and so down the line, particularly kind of like from the past 5 years or so, you're starting to now, us having been in Cloud Cuckoo Land, you are beginning to get people kind of like looking at things more realistically, and black South Africans asking tougher questions about what this change means. I mean, like on the surface, there's the veneer of okayness. People play golf together. We in the middle classes send our kids to the same school, to the same schools, and we go to the same restaurants, and we drink in the same bars, and so there's that okayness about it, and and people will be kind of like, but just listen to the talk shows, see the letters to the newspapers, see the comments on the kind of like on the websites about kind of like people responding to stories. And then you see the real, kind of like the deep divide that still exists within the society. And I think that we run the risk of ignoring that. And in 20 years' time, I'm not saying that there'll be some big conflagration, but it will hit us in a way that we don't know. And I think that that it needs to be confronted. Race in South Africa needs to be confronted immediately now, because apartheid was a very systematized thing, like over 50 years, and a lot of it was psychological and it was ingrained. A certain group of people were told that they were superior, and they were given the tools to act in a superior way, and certain people were told that they were inferior, and the system made them live in inferior circumstances. So you can't just have that happen in a. You can't just have that happen in a, as we say, like our miracle, the miracle that I spoke about earlier on. It has to happen in a very systematic way, and it's going to take some boldness from not only the political authority but the business authority, the economic authorities, in the corporate authority. And I think us in the media, we actually need to be much bolder in telling that story, that we're not in nirvana yet. Actually, kind of, there's still a long way to go. On the economy, it's become quite cliched for people to talk about the fact that South Africa is not growing at the same rate as other African countries. It's true. I mean, the other economies in the continent are growing at a much faster rate. But what people are not saying is of what base. And there are lots of economies that have taken off. I mean, like Mozambique, it's kind of like it's close to double digits at this particular point in time, and at some point it was 10%. Rwanda is growing at a massive rate. But of what base? South Africa is only growing at, I think, at this point, it's 2.5%. And I think, in as much as our policies could be a lot more attuned to us growing at a much faster rate, but I don't think we could match the growth rates of those particular countries. We could not match the growth rates of Nigeria, for instance, which has oil, and which, in as much as it's growing at that rate, I mean, like the wealth is not necessarily being shared kind of like equitably, and it's not filtering down. So I think. Yes, South Africa is not growing at that rate, but I do think that there are certain things which have to do with policy, which we have not done. I think kind of like the business, the environment around, like the regulatory environment not great. What the government has been, the pace of getting businesses licensed, the support for entrepreneurs. We've messed with our education system. We've wasted nearly 20 years with our education system. And so all those engines which could be fueling not growth rates of 10% or anything that some of the countries could be achieving, but I think we could be modestly driving growth rates of anywhere between 5 and 7%. And a lot of that has to do with the environment that the government is creating and has been able to create. And then again, and then another environment is the environment that the business sector actually kind of like, because the business sector has not come to the party in terms of our own business sector, in terms of actually investing in the country's future, taking the risks that foreign investors sometimes would be prepared to take. And if our own business sector is not taking the risks in our own country, foreign investors will not do so as enthusiastically as they would. We did mess up by allowing some false debates to dominate our discourse over the past few years, and the debate around nationalization, which was a non-debate, but actually in the mind of anybody who wants to plow money in your country, you think twice. You may get 1 million assurances, but so long as that debate is still raging and people perceived to be powerful in the governing party are saying these things and nobody's shutting them down immediately. Fortunately now that debate is over, but it cost us a good few years of positive investor sentiment. And now to get back and to get the Fitches and the Standards and Poor's and all of those people to start to see us in a positive light, and it takes a lot. And all investors want is a sense of certainty, and we gave them uncertainty, and unfortunately that has messed us.
And the question
and
about
the question around
moguls, since Cyril Ramaphosa was chair when you were editing the paper, if I remember right? No?
No. Cyril Ramaphosa was out of the picture back in the early 2000s.
Okay.
You know what, I don't fear that at all. From where I sit, Tokyo Sekwale, in fact, was his company called Mandela. Just for those who don't know, Tokyo Sekwale is a big businessman in South Africa. He had presidential ambitions at some point, and he's
on his way down.
Yeah, he's on his way down, and politically. And so he'd probably go back to business now. But he's a minister in government at this point. But when he went into government, he let go of all his business dealings and he put them all in a blunt trust. So this was in 2009. He actually has been he was the majority shareholder in Avusa, our company, from 2006. And his company owned 28% of us, and so his company was the shareholder of reference, and there were others, like the institutional shareholders and much smaller shareholders around. And like, it then reduced to about to the early 20s, but he remained that. And they never interfered, not one bit. When he was running for president of the ANC in 2007, we never heard from him. We never heard from his lieutenants. They did not try to influence anything. We wrote terrible stories about him. We lampooned him.
I'll testify to that. You wouldn't have imagined that the major investor, a controlling partner in a company that was owned a newspaper, could produce such sometimes vicious, I have to say, coverage of Tokyo.
Yeah, exactly. The only phone call I ever had from Tokyo Sekwale was when he was sponsoring a race car for some race, and he was doing a test drive in the race, and he called me up and said, I'm doing this thing. Don't you think it might make a nice front page picture? And I told him, look, we're covering the test run anyway. So depending on kind of like on the quality of the picture, we may or may not put it in the newspaper.
And did you?
Well, it made it onto page 20-something. I mean, like, it was, but I mean, like, that was it, and there's only time ever that. So Cyril Ramaphosa was wanting to, who's another businessman, as many of you will know.
And now deputy
is
president
now
of the party.
ANC, and he was interested in buying independent newspaper, which was like the second, which is like one of the big newspaper groups in the country. But now he's gone into politics. He's gonna put his business interest in a blind trust as well. He's no longer going to be actively involved in business, and I don't think his bid for independent newspapers is going to succeed. I mean, like his company's bid for independent newspapers is going to succeed anyway. So that fear of media barons with political ambitions it's not really there. It's not a fear that kind of like that's there. And even if the two of them were to be in ownership of newspapers, there is a very strong tradition in South Africa which actually even precedes the democracy, precedes 1994, of that Chinese wall between editorial and the commercial side. Editors do
Maybe
not.
it's a South African wall
Yeah.
instead of a Chinese wall.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so editors have never tolerated any interference, and in cases where it has happened, it has been a huge deal, and editors have walked out, and owners have and owners basically know their place. Managers know their place, and except for kind of like there's a new newspaper now that has started, but it started by a family which is close to the president. And there's no Chinese wall at all. It's actually started by Indians, so there's no
There's no Indian wall.
There's no Indian wall there. But generally, in most media organizations in South Africa, there's a very strict divide. And should there be a point where, whether it's the owners or it's the management of a company that is interfering in newspaper, it would be a huge deal, because what they know is that it would then open the way for the government then to be able to say, look, if management is dictating to editors, then we too have the chance to dictate to editors. So, and the organization that I belong to, I mean, like we're very firm on that, and we have kind of like every few years we have meeting with the owners and kind of like just talk industry issues, and it's one line that we repeat all the time. So we will we defend our turf against our owners in as much as we defend our turf against the government or other interests.
Okay, I think that's the perfect note to end on. One more thing, actually, in the American context, many of those walls have begun to dissolve, and I think one more place that we actually have something to learn from what South African journalists have done and are doing to build this new and very robust new democracy. So we are going to have a reception, food there, but before we break, I just want to pay tribute briefly to Lauren Giglioni, who has now started successful programs at USC, at Emory, and at Medill that allows something like 150 students over the course of those three programs to have this experience, to bring it back, and to train the next generation of people who are going to do global journalism of this kind. So we owe a big debt to Lauren.
Not wanting to have the last word, but just also, yeah, just to do the same, yeah, to pay tribute to Lauren and to this institution for actually recognizing South Africa as a place where journalists can go, and American journalists can go and experience the world and experience news telling, experience storytelling, and for them to be able to forge ties with their fellow tribesmen elsewhere on this planet. And I've, over the years, the first time I got to know Doug, and there's always been like a really supreme and majestic group of students who have come through, and there's nothing as exciting as interacting with them while they're in South Africa, and many of my editors in South Africa will attest to that. And it is something that I would kind of like hope that in 50 years' time, if we're all still around, that it's still continuing, because it's a really, really, it's a great bond that exists between the South African media and this institution, and it's something that really needs to be cemented and promoted.
Well, thanks for that. It's been a real honor to have you here, Mondli.